Camille Langford never imagined the two people she loved most would become the ones she hated most. Dorian, her devoted husband. Liana, her trusted sister. The betrayal was not just an affair. It was a secret that grew inside Liana, proof of their ultimate betrayal. As Camille stared at the blood pooling beneath them, she realized there was no turning back. Dorian Hensley and his wife Camille had built a seemingly perfect life together. Their suburban home was nestled in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood where everything appeared peaceful. With 2 young children, a stable marriage, and a close-knit family, they were admired by many. Camille was known for her kindness and warmth, while Dorian, a hard-working man, was respected for his dedication to his family. From the outside, their marriage looked like a dream, one built on love, trust, and unwavering support. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form, and no one had noticed how deep they truly ran. Camille's younger sister, Liana Voss, had always been a significant part of their lives. She was vibrant, carefree, and beautiful in a way that made people stop and stare. As the younger sibling, she had spent much of her life looking up to Camille, admiring her strength and the life she had built with Dorian. She visited often, helping with the children, staying over for long weekends, and sharing laughter-filled dinners at their home. To everyone, she was more than just Camille's sister. She was part of the family. But something had changed in the past year. The way Dorian looked at Liana had shifted. It was subtle at first. Longer glances, fleeting moments of silence when their hands brushed, a lingering gaze when he thought no one was watching. Liana noticed it too, but she ignored the warning signs, convincing herself it was nothing. Yet deep down there was something thrilling about it. A dangerous allure she couldn't quite resist. The affair began innocently enough, or at least that's what they told themselves. It started with late-night conversations when Camille had already gone to bed, soft laughter over shared secrets and stolen moments that left them breathless with guilt and desire. They never intended for it to go as far as it did, but once the line was crossed, there was no turning back. The thrill of secrecy only intensified their passion, and soon their encounters became more reckless. Dorian found reasons to be alone with Liana, offering to drive her home late at night, finding excuses to brush past her in the kitchen, and lingering in her presence even when he knew Camille was nearby. Liana, despite knowing how wrong it was, couldn't pull herself away. The guilt was suffocating, but the temptation was stronger. They convinced themselves it wasn't hurting anyone as long as Camille never found out. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and this one was no exception. Liana had grown careless, leaving traces of the affair in places where they didn't belong. A text left unanswered on Dorian's phone, a slip of emotion in her voice when she spoke of him, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air whenever Camille was around. She hadn't realized how much her feelings had grown, how much she had allowed herself to believe that Dorian might one day choose her. Then, everything changed with a single test. The 2 pink lines stared back at her, sending a wave of panic through her body. She read it over and over, hoping it was a mistake, but there was no denying what it meant. She was pregnant. For the first time, the weight of their actions crushed her. This was no longer just a secret affair. It was something irreversible. Liana's hands trembled as she tried to process what to do next. She could keep quiet and disappear, but she knew that was impossible. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. The consequences were no longer something she could ignore. Her entire world had just shifted, and she knew there was no way to stop the devastation that was about to unfold. Liana's hands shook as she clutched the pregnancy test, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Panic coursed through her veins, drowning out every rational thought. She tried to convince herself there had to be another way, some way to keep the truth buried, but deep down she knew it was impossible. A secret like this could never stay hidden. The longer she waited, the worse it would become. Camille would find out. Dorian would have to face the reality of what they had done. There was no easy way out. For hours, she sat alone in her tiny apartment, her mind racing through every possible outcome. She imagined Camille's face when she learned the truth, the look of betrayal that would follow, the pain she would never recover from. Liana had stolen something irreplaceable: her sister's trust, her marriage, the very foundation of her life. It was a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake, and now she would have to live with the consequences. When she finally mustered the courage to speak, she knew there was only one person she could go to first: Dorian. He needed to know, before Camille did. Maybe, just maybe, they could figure out a way to soften the blow, to make it seem like something other than the unforgivable betrayal that it was. She sent him a simple message, one that carried a weight heavier than anything she had ever typed before. When he arrived at her apartment that evening, the look on his face was one of exhaustion and fear. He had sensed something was wrong the moment she had asked him to come over. He sat down, rubbing his temples, already knowing that whatever she had to say would change everything. She didn't waste time. She placed the pregnancy test on the table between them, watching as his face drained of color. For a long moment, he was silent, staring at it as if it might disappear if he looked away long enough. But it didn't. The reality was sinking in, fast and merciless. Dorian's mind spiraled into chaos. His marriage was already strained after months of deception, but this? There was no covering this up, no talking his way out of it. Camille would know. There was no way she wouldn't find out. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to think, but nothing made sense anymore. The walls of his carefully constructed life were collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Liana waited for him to say something, anything, but the silence stretched between them like an endless abyss. She could see the regret in his eyes, the fear, the realization that he had destroyed everything he had worked so hard to protect. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself, angry that he had let it come to this. But none of it mattered anymore. The only thing left to do was tell Camille. Liana couldn't bear the weight of the secret alone any longer. The guilt was suffocating, pressing down on her like a crushing weight. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't go a single moment without feeling like she was drowning. So she did what she had been dreading for weeks. She drove to Camille's house and told her the truth. The moment the words left her mouth, Camille's expression twisted into something unrecognizable. Shock, horror, disbelief. It all played across her face in rapid succession. And then came the rage, a kind of anger Liana had never seen before, one that burned with the intensity of a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. The betrayal ran deeper than words could ever describe. Camille's own sister, her husband, the two people she had trusted most in the world had conspired behind her back, shattering the very foundation of her life. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a calculated, deliberate betrayal, one that cut deeper than any wound ever could. Camille's voice trembled as she demanded answers, but nothing Liana said could make it better. The damage was done. The life she had known was over. When Dorian arrived home that night, Camille was waiting for him. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking, but her voice was steady. There was no yelling, no hysterics, just a cold, bitter finality. She told him to pack his things and leave. She didn't care where he went. He was no longer her husband. Dorian tried to speak, tried to reason with her, but the look in her eyes told him there was no point. He had lost her. He had lost everything. Liana had destroyed her relationship with the one person who had always been there for her. Dorian had ruined the family he had promised to protect. And Camille, once so full of love and warmth, was left, standing in the ruins of a life she no longer recognized. The damage was done, but the worst was yet to come. Camille sat in the dimly lit living room, her mind numb from exhaustion. It had been 3 days since the truth unraveled, and yet the anger inside her hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger, twisting into something dark and uncontrollable. She replayed every moment in her head. The stolen glances, the sudden distance in her marriage, the unexplained tension between Dorian and Liana. It had all been right in front of her, yet she had refused to see it. The betrayal cut deeper than she thought possible. Her husband, her sister, the two people she trusted most, had torn her life apart. Dorian had left, but his presence still lingered in every corner of the house. His clothes were gone, his side of the bed empty, yet Camille could still feel him there, as if his ghost refused to leave. The silence in the house was suffocating. Their children, too young to understand the depth of what had happened, sensed something was wrong. Their once happy home was now filled with tension, with whispered conversations and heavy stares. Camille knew she had to be strong for them, but she was crumbling inside. Liana had tried calling, but Camille refused to answer. She wanted nothing to do with her sister. She wasn't family anymore. She was nothing. The betrayal was unforgivable, and no apology could change that. Camille had spent years protecting Liana, looking out for her, making sure she never had to struggle. And this was how she was repaid. But anger wasn't enough. Camille needed justice. She needed revenge. The thought consumed her, creeping into her mind during the quiet hours of the night. She imagined every possible way to make them suffer as she had suffered, exposing them to the world, ruining their reputations, making sure neither of them ever found peace again. But nothing felt like enough. No punishment could erase the pain they had caused. Meanwhile, Dorian was falling apart in his own way. He had moved into a small apartment across town, but it didn't feel like home. The walls were bare, the rooms lifeless, much like the state of his own mind. He had lost everything in a matter of days. His marriage, his children, his entire future had been ripped away because of one selfish decision after another. The weight of it all pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Liana was no better. She had imagined a different outcome, one where Dorian might choose her, where they could find a way to navigate the chaos together. But reality had been much harsher. Dorian was distant now, barely speaking to her. His guilt made it impossible for him to even look at her the same way. And Camille, her sister, her closest friend, had erased her completely. Liana had destroyed the only family she had ever known, and now she was left to face the consequences alone. She had thought about leaving town, starting over somewhere far away where no one knew what she had done. But she couldn't. The life growing inside her tied her to this place, to this mistake. There was no escaping it. She had to face it, no matter how unbearable it was. Camille's rage festered as the days passed. She barely ate, barely slept. Every second that went by was filled with thoughts of Dorian and Liana, of how they had humiliated her, shattered her trust, and left her with nothing but misery. It wasn't fair. They didn't get to walk away while she suffered. The idea came to her one evening, creeping into her mind like a whisper in the dark. A way to end it. A way to make sure neither of them ever hurt her again. The thought should have scared her, should have made her second-guess herself. But it didn't. It felt right. She had always been the kind of person to forgive, to see the best in others. But this time, there was no room for mercy. What they had done was unforgivable. And soon they would understand the true meaning of betrayal. Camille's transformation was slow, but it was certain. The pain had reshaped her into something unrecognizable. The woman who once believed in love, family, and loyalty had disappeared, leaving behind a shell filled only with anger and the desire for revenge. The thought of Dorian and Liana moving on, continuing their lives while she suffered, was unbearable. They had destroyed everything, and yet they got to live without consequence. That wasn't justice. That wasn't fair. She spent her nights awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment Liana had confessed. The way her sister's lips had trembled, the way her eyes had darted away in shame. Camille had given her the chance to explain, to somehow make it right. But there was no explanation that could fix what had been done. The betrayal was absolute. Dorian had been no better. His silence, his pathetic attempt at excuses, it all fueled the fire inside her. Her anger needed an outlet. It wasn't enough to block Liana's number or ignore Dorian's desperate messages begging to see the children. It wasn't enough to sit in her empty home, drowning in bitterness while they carried on. She needed more. She needed an ending. The plan came together slowly, piece by piece, in the quiet darkness of her mind. It was brutal, unforgiving, but it was what they deserved. She had always been the one to sacrifice, the one to put others before herself. Not anymore. Now, she would take something back. She reached out to Dorian first. He had been careful to keep his distance, avoiding the house unless necessary, knowing that Camille wanted nothing to do with him. But when she sent him a message, simple, cold, direct, he responded immediately. He still thought there was a way to fix things, that maybe time would soften the wounds. He had no idea how wrong he was. She told him to come over late at night after the children had gone to sleep. She made it sound like a discussion, like there was some possibility of closure. He agreed without hesitation. Liana was next. Camille hadn't spoken to her since that night, hadn't even acknowledged her existence. But she knew her sister was desperate for forgiveness. So when Camille sent a message saying she was willing to talk, Liana jumped at the chance. She had no clue what she was walking into. The night arrived, and Camille felt nothing. No nerves, no second thoughts, only an eerie calm. She had played this moment over in her mind too many times to feel fear. She set the stage carefully, making sure everything was in place. When Dorian arrived first, she let him in, her expression unreadable. He hesitated, sensing something was off, but before he could say a word, she let him inside. Then came Liana. She arrived hopeful, believing in redemption, in the possibility that her sister might still love her. The moment Camille opened the door, she knew she had been wrong. The look in Camille's eyes sent a chill through her, but by the time she realized the danger, it was too late. The confrontation was brutal. Camille unleashed everything she had kept buried, every ounce of pain, every unsaid word, every moment of agony. Dorian tried to reason with her, to calm her down, but Camille wasn't listening. She had gone too far to turn back now. The moment the knife entered Dorian's chest, everything became silent. He gasped, eyes wide with shock, hands grasping at the wound as if he could undo what had just happened. Blood spilled onto the floor, staining the home they had built together. Liana screamed, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. Camille turned to her sister, her hands trembling, but steady. There was no mercy left inside her. Liana had taken everything from her, and now Camille would take something back. The house was quiet, except for the sound of shallow breathing and the occasional drip of blood hitting the floor. Camille stood motionless, staring at the mess before her. Dorian lay on his back, his body twitching as his hands weakly pressed against the deep wound in his chest. His breaths were ragged, uneven, as if his body was trying to hold on to life, but failing. His eyes were wide with shock, his mouth slightly open as though he wanted to say something. Maybe he was trying to beg. Maybe he was asking why. But Camille didn't care anymore. Liana was frozen in place, her back pressed against the wall, her entire body shaking. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with terror. She looked like she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She had spent so much time chasing after something that didn't belong to her, sneaking around, destroying lives, and now she was finally feeling the weight of what she had done. Camille tightened her grip on the knife, her breath steady despite the chaos. She had never imagined herself capable of something like this, but now that it had begun, she felt no regret, no sadness, only the cold satisfaction of knowing that they would never hurt her again. Liana tried to run, but Camille was faster. She lunged forward, grabbing her sister by the wrist, dragging her down before she could escape. Liana struggled, her hands clawing at Camille's arms, but she was weak. She had always been weak. Tears streamed down Liana's face as she choked out desperate, trembling breaths. She looked up at Camille, her expression pleading, but Camille only saw the face of a liar, a traitor, someone who had taken everything from her and expected forgiveness. The first stab was deep, cutting through flesh like paper. Liana gasped, her body jerking in pain. The second stab came faster, then another. The white fabric of her dress turned crimson, and her hands, once grasping at Camille's arms, went limp. Her breath hitched, her mouth opened as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Camille sat back, staring at what she had done. Blood pooled around her feet, staining her hands, soaking into the floor. The room smelled of iron, thick and suffocating. Dorian had stopped moving. His chest barely rose and fell, his breaths slower, weaker, until finally there was nothing. Just silence. For the first time in days, Camille felt at peace. The storm inside her had settled. She had taken back her power, taken back the life they had stolen from her. But now, she was left with the consequences. The weight of reality sank in as she stood up, her legs unsteady. Her hands were sticky with blood, her clothes ruined. The house, once a home, was now a crime scene. There was no undoing what she had done. She thought about running, disappearing. But where would she go? What would she say? The children were asleep upstairs, unaware that their world had just changed forever. A siren wailed in the distance, faint but growing louder. Someone must have heard the struggle. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe one of them had managed to call for help before it was too late. Camille didn't move. She didn't try to escape. There was nowhere to go. Instead, she stood in the middle of the room, staring at the lifeless bodies of the two people who had betrayed her. And she waited for the inevitable. The red and blue lights flashed through the windows, illuminating the horror she had created. Heavy footsteps pounded against the porch, voices shouted commands, but Camille remained still. The door burst open. The officers stormed in, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the scene before them. Someone shouted for her to get on the ground. Camille slowly lowered herself, her hands still covered in blood, her expression blank. As they restrained her, pressing her to the cold floor, she closed her eyes. She had lost everything, but at least now, so had they.